I'm Hallie. It's good to be with you tonight on a day and night of remembrances in Scotland, ahead of tomorrow when the body of Queen Elizabeth II goes back to London to prepare for her funeral next week. And today we've seen the royal family mourning alongside thousands of people at St. Giles Cathedral. You see the Queen's children there, including King Charles. After a service of thanksgiving, thousands of people lining the streets of the Royal Mile outside. And I want you to listen to this just for a second. It was so quiet, it was so solemn, you could even hear the clip-clop of the horses coming as the procession made its way down the street. The day, highlighting some of what King Charles now faces as he balances grief with duty. Do you see him there? He just got out of that car. He's in that traditional kilt, going into Scottish Parliament. Lawmakers sharing stories, sharing condolences, and Charles sharing a message of his own.
I take up my new duties with thankfulness for all that Scotland has given me, with resolve to seek always the welfare of our country and its people.
But the backdrop here, Scotland is a country where people have, complicated feelings about being in the United Kingdom. The country's held votes to leave the UK, and there are questions about whether the Queen's popularity will now extend to her son. Across the 14 other countries where King Charles is head of state, that is mostly symbolic, but you've got many of them divided over whether he still should be, or whether they should follow the path of others, like Barbados last November, and renounce the British monarchy. Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand says she could see it happening in her lifetime there, although not soon. Watch.
I've never sensed an urgency. There's so many challenges we face. This is a large, significant debate. I don't think it's one that would or should occur quickly.
Others are following the lead of the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, who's saying this week he plans a referendum within the next 3 years. We're going to talk about that more with Kerry Sanders, who's posted up in Jamaica in just a second. But I want to start with Matt Bradley in London. And Matt, talk to us about what happens from here as it relates to the remembrances for Queen Elizabeth, because you've got King Charles set to visit Northern Ireland. That's another place where there is more of a nationalist sentiment. And yet at the center of this all, right, is not just a king balancing his duties, but a king balancing the grief, a son balancing the grief of losing his mother.
Yeah, Hallie, I mean, what you're looking here is like two separate but, parallel tracks. You're watching the Queen, or rather the body of the Queen, and her coffin traveling through all of the British Isles, allowing the nation to say goodbye to her, to mourn her. And she's going through Scotland and then down to here in London tomorrow, where she will be lying in state very briefly at Buckingham Palace before she goes to this building behind me to Westminster Hall, where she'll be lying in state for 4 days. In parallel to that, you've got the new king. You've got King Charles III. He is also going through the work, and this is a separate operation, of also knitting together all of the constituent countries within the United Kingdom. Because remember, this is a united kingdom. There's 4 different countries that make this up, and they're not always totally unified, even though it seems like they always act in concert together. It's a lot of hard work to keep these countries from declaring that they want to renounce the Queen and get rid of the monarchy and make themselves their own republics. A lot of these countries have done more than just flirt with this in the past couple of days. So You're seeing Scotland right now, where obviously we saw the new king talking to Scottish members of parliament. Even some of the stalwart Republicans didn't really raise a lot of Republican fuss today. They wanted to mourn and talk about the Queen. Then he's going to be going to Northern Ireland, which has already been cast into really extreme doubt by Brexit, that other big issue that's been vexing this country for the last several years. So yeah, this is not just a question of, the Queen dies and we have a new king. This whole process is trying to demonstrate continuity. That's why that famous phrase, "The Queen is dead, long live the king." The whole idea is there's no daylight between one sovereign and the next. That's why both of these things have to happen in parallel. Hallie?
It's an important point, Matt. There's also, I think about what the leader of New Zealand said, the idea that there is a discussion more broadly about what the future of the Commonwealth holds. But as she said, in her view, not now. Right now is the time to say goodbye to a woman who has led the monarchy now for decades.
She said not now, but I think she also said something that's really revealing, Hallie. She said there's no rush. And that really says a lot, because the fact is, when you talk to British people, when you talk to Australian people and Canadian people, even if they're Republicans, even if they hate the idea of the monarchy, and you get a lot of people who are really far left, who think this whole thing is a vestige of, ancient times and past unequal systems and just sky-high privilege. There's all sorts of attendant issues and symbols that go along with this that people don't really like. So why aren't they getting rid of it? Why aren't they so determined to become republics and get rid of the monarchy? It's because the fact is, Hallie, the monarchy has saved itself by making itself irrelevant, by making itself not political. That's what's allowed it to preserve its privileges and its prerogatives, even though it's kind of an antiquated institution. So when someone like Asern says, there's no rush, it's because a lot of people, they don't notice the monarchy in their day-to-day lives or in the ordinary politics of their country. So it's not a rush for them to get rid of it. It doesn't cause a lot of problems for them.
Matt Bradley live for us there in London, where I know we will see more remembrances, much more tomorrow and the days to come. Thanks, Matt. I want to turn to Kerry Sanders now, who's on the ground in Jamaica, where people there, Kerry, as you well know, you've been talking to them, are having this moment where I think some are grappling with what does it mean to stay in the Commonwealth or not?
This is one of those Commonwealth countries, which to define what a Commonwealth realm is they have their own government here, but they recognize the head of state previously as the Queen and now the King. And there are questions here about whether that should remain, in part because of the history of the royal family. It dates back to 1660, so we're going way back in history. But it was the Royal African Company, the shipping company, that brought the slaves here. And so the descendants who were enslaved here, well, first of all, the folks who were enslaved here worked on plantations, harvesting sugar, which was like green gold. And their descendants today are saying, wait a second, why are we still looking at the head of state across the ocean in England, in the United Kingdom? And their questions, well, listen to what some of the comments are from those who are now rather vocally saying, maybe it's time in the aftermath of the Queen's death.
When blacks were brought from the African continent, they did not come here as slaves. They were enslaved when they got here.
The real talking point is about reparations, one, but most importantly about apology.
Why should we be looking across the Atlantic to a white woman or a white man?
And so those questions are rather vocal. Whether there will be a referendum vote soon or not, that still is in the works. But there's a lot of feelings here that it just doesn't make sense in 2022 the way it may have once seemingly made sense. Hallie?
Well, what does that look like in practical terms, Kerry? In other words, help us understand, how does life change or not if a country were to replace King Charles as head of state?
This is a very American view, I was told by many people I've spoken to here, about trying to understand the Commonwealth realm. Because from an American point of view, we think you give something, you get something. There is not necessarily a quid pro quo here where the Jamaicans give something and get something. The recognition of the head of state in many ways is symbolic. About the only structural thing that really holds with the government here is, to use an analogy to our U.S. Supreme Court, if you were to run through the court system here and want to appeal to the highest court, that would go to England, to the Privy Court. But you have to understand that in not only Jamaica, but in other Commonwealth realms, especially in the West Indies and the Caribbean, some people look at that as a good thing because they fear that politics may be involved in the court system and that by going halfway around the world to England might actually be a benefit. But it's important to note, that comes at your own expense. It's a lot of money to get over there, a lot of money to stay. It really raises a lot of questions. But in terms of what we think about the Commonwealth realm, which is really something that is not part of our everyday conversation, we have obviously the Commonwealth of Massachusetts stuff, but when you look at that, it is not a give and take. It's not as if their defense is really set up by the British Defense Department. It very much an independent government here in that sense, but with the history and a legacy of recognizing the head of state as the Queen and now the King, that's something that many people say shouldn't remain, and many others say, no, we like it just the way it is. Hallie?
Kerry Sanders with that Jamaica Dateline. Kerry, we're glad to see you reporting from Jamaica for us tonight. Thank you so much. Back here to Washington now, where just a few hours ago, former President Trump's legal teams pushing back on the DOJ's two potential candidates who could be that independent party reviewing documents that the FBI took from Mar-a-Lago. This comes after another defiant court filing where the Trump team showed they're still going to try to fight this whole investigation by questioning whether the documents were actually classified, even though, by the way, the documents had classified markings on them. It's all part of a broader response, asking the judge involved in the case to keep prosecutors from reviewing about 100 pages of that secret or top secret, et cetera, material, after the Justice Department had asked that judge to lift the ban before the independent third party weighed in. Let me just stop and take a step back here, right? Because there is also something that's happening in this broader moment. There's this fight happening over documents at Mar-a-Lago, and it's against this backdrop of a precarious political moment, frankly, a tinderbox. And you had a woman in Texas arrested for allegedly threatening that judge, the Florida judge who okayed Mr. Trump's request for that third party. I want to bring in now Ken Delaney. And Ken, let me take this in a couple of buckets. Let me start with the legal buckets, right? And I want to cut through some of the weedsy stuff, and let's just get to the point. Not surprising that the Trump legal team said, hey, Department of Justice, I don't want the people you picked to be this so-called special master, this third party. I want these other people. Okay, fine, not a shocking legal filing. There's another legal filing today in which the Trump team was defiant, basically pushing back on other things that the Justice Department wants. And in these legal, when you take them all together, Ken, here's what is not said, which I think is super important here. Nowhere do the attorneys for Donald Trump try to make the case that the former president declassified these documents before he left office. That had been the PR response thus far to this point, right, from Mr. Trump and his allies. That is not the legal response as we're seeing now reiterated today.
No, Hallie, and I don't believe they can make that argument in court because there's no evidence for it. And we've talked to a number of former officials who say there's no evidence for it. But what they can do is raise it as a defense at trial. And that's what's so interesting about this filing today from the Trump team. It's not really about the special master. It appears they're going to lose on that point, if not before this judge, then before the appeals court, specifically with regard to the classified documents, because it's the executive branch that has sway and say over what's classified and what isn't classified. But what they're doing with this document is offering a defense. It's a multi-pronged defense. First of all, they say this is really just a dispute about document storage of presidential records between Donald Trump and the National Archives. This isn't about crimes. Secondly, they say the national security threat that the DOJ is raising from these documents is completely overblown. They're saying they were at Mar-a-Lago, they were in a storage room guarded by the Secret Service. There's no threat. And they are saying that the president has inherent declassification authority, so the onus is on the Justice Department to prove that those classification markings actually meant the documents were still classified. It's an interesting set of defenses. I think that's going to have no bearing on the issue of the special master. Really, what they're doing is previewing Trump's defense at trial. But when the executive branch comes and says, look, these are very seriously dangerous documents that shouldn't get in the wrong hands, it's really hard for a judge to second guess that. And I don't really see where the Trump team is making that argument, not knowing everything that the intelligence officials who helped prepare these documents know, Hallie.
Talk to you about this arrest of this woman in Texas, right? Threatening, allegedly, this judge who's the center of this case. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, this is a really awful situation. So this woman was charged with making criminal threats, allegedly said some really vile and hateful things on voicemails and emails to this judge. But the court records also say that she was interviewed by the Secret Service earlier this year over threats that she made to Donald Trump, and that she is impersonated or posed as a CIA officer and a Navy SEAL. So, and that her mother said that she had mental issues. So this doesn't seem like this threat was ever in any danger of being carried out. But I think, Hallie, it underscores what you were alluding to, this sort of really volatile nature of our politics right now, where this rhetoric is flying around, so that where people are on the edge, get sucked into doing things they might not otherwise do because reputable politicians are doing things like comparing the FBI to the Gestapo.
Ken Delaney, and thank you for being all over it for us, and I appreciate it as always. To the west now, where nearly 100 wildfires are burning. Thousands of people have been forced to evacuate. And now there are some new worries about the air quality in Oregon and Washington and Idaho because there is so much smoke in that region. Look at just Oregon alone, right? 10 wildfires are burning there, including the Cedar Creek fire, which has forced 2,200 homes, hundreds of businesses to be evacuated. That fire was sparked by a lightning storm back in early August. It was contained at about 12%, but that dropped down to 0% over the weekend because it was so windy and so dry. The fire basically exploded to 32,000 acres inside, erasing, all that progress that they had previously made. And listen, it is not new that there are wildfires out west, okay? But they are getting worse because of record heat conditions, record drought conditions, too. Let me bring in NBC's Steve Patterson, and I think that's an important point here, Steve. It's not just wallpaper video of wildfires in the west, right? Like, this is not normal. It is not normal fire season. It hasn't been out west. Help us put that into context from that sort of sweepier historic perspective.
Well, let me just pick up with the tally, right? So 11 fires burning in California, 18 across Oregon and Washington state. These are just the large active wildfires. So if you look at the totality of it, 92 burning across the country. That's covering more than 720,000 acres. These fires stoked by that incredible heat wave last week over some of the driest vegetation, of course, that the West has ever seen because, again, of this mega drought. We've been preaching about this and yelling about this, now fanned by these winds that just happen to come this year. This is an every year thing. And then you add on top of that the tropical storm that this region just had. So there's something like 5,000 firefighters in Oregon and Washington state alone, many of them focused on that Cedar Creek fire, now more than 87,000 acres. Still, as you mentioned, threatening 2,200 homes, back to 0% containment. That never used to happen when I first started this job. These states in the Pacific Northwest, look, they've always had fires. But, because of the drive from climate change, that's worsening. Because of the mega drought, that's worsening. We're starting to see the intensity and the size of the California fires, of course, which is very, very troubling. Speaking of California, by the way, that state just coming off this insane week of record temperatures, capped off by that tropical storm, which was kind of a double-edged sword because it did help cool temperatures. It basically ended the heat wave, and it dumped rain directly on some of those fires, including that Fairview fire. But it also, made for another disastrous situation with the possibility of flash flooding. It is very troubling to be out west because of all the storm systems, because of all the heat, because of all the fires that are persisting through this, and all of it, of course, driven by our changing climate. Hallie.
And it's not just how it feels, right, Steve? It's how you are literally breathing, how you are experiencing air with these real concerns of air quality now, especially in Washington state. You saw Seattle with its worst air quality rating in 2 years this weekend. It feels like the health concerns are getting serious on that front there.
Worst in 2 years, and Seattle on Sunday was the worst city for air quality in the world, in the entire world. And it's troubling for a few reasons. I've done a few stories on this. Studies have found that even if you're in a city that's not in a fire zone, that's just adjacent, like Seattle, for example, right now, the visits to the emergency room go up. If you are very young or very old, so infants and elderly, you're at increased risk. If you have any sort of respiratory illness, we're talking about anything from asthma to, of course, let's not forget, COVID-19, you're at increased risk. If you have heart conditions, you're at increased risk. So long-term problems and short-term problems all made worse by wildfire, all because they're settling over these cities instead of dispersing in the wilderness because we've built up so much. So they're in what's called the urban interface. So they're burning more hazardous materials that come from burning a house down. So not only are people losing their house, but that goes into the air, hurting more people across the country. It's just a compounding situation, and it's only going to get worse.
Yeah.
Hallie.
It's not a good cycle. Steve Patterson, I'm glad you're on top of it for us. Thank you. Keep us updated. I'm sure we'll be talking again in the days to come. Out in Boston tonight, you've got President Biden saying the country is not doing enough for cancer patients and their families to navigate the healthcare system, announcing some new steps to try to, he hopes, end cancer as we know it. Where did he do it from? The John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum on the 60th anniversary of Kennedy's speech about putting a man on the moon. That's why he calls it the Cancer Moonshot Initiative, right? Because this is ambitious. This is big. This is reaching for the stars. Right? It's aimed at trying to prevent people from dying from cancer. Listen to the president.
For each of the ways we know cancer today, we know we can change the trajectory.
This is important to the president, not just on a macro level, but a micro level, right? It's personal for him. He lost his son, Bo, to brain cancer back in 2015. Cancer is the second leading cause of death in the United States. Putting that into the context, the American Cancer Society estimates Nearly 2 million cancer cases will be diagnosed this year alone, and more than 609,000 people will die of cancer. Monica Alba is in Boston. We know cancer is bad. Monica, we know people die from it. We know it is serious. The president is trying to meet what is a broader moment here with what is, admittedly, from their perspective, a hugely ambitious project to try to, win the fight against cancer. Talk about the support that President Biden has here. And I just think the symbolism where you are of the president and the backdrop of the JFK library there, that moonshot speech, there are some interesting parallels.
Certainly, Hallie, it is an extremely ambitious goal. The president wants to reduce cancer deaths by 50% over the next 25 years. And the way he's going to do it, he announced today in this speech with a very fitting backdrop, is by trying to get more funding in the biomedical sphere, trying to boost that kind of innovation for some blood tests that federally backed studies have showed can perhaps detect cancer at an earlier stage than we've seen in the past. But if you do flash back to 60 years ago and when JFK gave that famous speech, there was about $20 billion behind that initiative for Apollo. You put that in inflation numbers today, that equals more than $220 billion that would have been the case. And that's just not the kind of money right now that this White House or this president has to put behind it. So that's why the White House is going to gather some industry leaders in this biomedical field on Wednesday at the White House to try to have a meeting and see where they can get this funding. They're going to really have to rely more on the private sector. But the president absolutely hearkening back to those words from 60 years ago and putting it in these very personal terms, and also trying to have this moment of national unity, saying that cancer does not discriminate, whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, red or blue. And he is saying it's something he hopes everybody can come together to try to put an end to in the near future, Hallie.
Monica Alba live for us there with the president in Boston. Mon, thank you. It's been more than 200 days of war now between Russia and Ukraine. But tonight could be. It is possible that we are seeing a tipping point here in favor of the Ukrainian military. That's because those troops are pushing deeper into territory that had been controlled by Russia, a move that military and security analysts are calling extraordinary and a clear moment in this war. The Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, has said their military has retaken about 2,300 square miles this month. That's an area almost twice the size of Rhode Island, right? It's a lot of territory. We should note that NBC News has not independently verified those claims. But the Kremlin today is insisting Russian President Putin will not back down. That's been a big question, right? What does Vladimir Putin do next? Megan Fitzgerald is in Kyiv for us tonight.
It's been 2 weeks exactly to the day since the Ukrainians launched this counteroffensive. Since then, Ukraine's President Zelensky is saying that they've been able to recapture some 2,300 square miles of territory. Now, this counteroffensive was launched in the southern part of the country, in the Kherson region, but we're seeing some significant advancements, especially over the last several days, in the northeastern part of the country, in the Kharkiv region. There, Zelensky says that they've been able to take back dozens and dozens of towns and settlements in the area there. And we're already seeing video from soldiers on the ground of people in those areas rushing to these soldiers, thanking them for liberating them. Many of these people living in Russian-occupied territory for months now. We've also seen in this region where the Russian soldiers have retreated. Of course, the Russian Defense Ministry is saying that they're not retreating. They're just redeploying their troops to the east. But this is certainly significant advancements that we're seeing here by the Ukrainians. Meanwhile, all eyes on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, where some good news, some positive news for the first time in several weeks. Ukrainian officials, energy officials, are saying that they've been able to restore a second power line to this plant. Of course, the concern here is increased shelling at any time could knock these plants, these lines going to the plant offline. But at this point, there is some good news that the plant is being powered by 2 external lines. Back to you.
Our Megan Fitzgerald reporting for us there from Ukraine. Coming up here on the show, an unexpected moment during closing arguments of the R. Kelly trial. We'll talk about that in a minute. Plus, a former NFL assistant coach pleading guilty to a drunk driving crash that left a little girl with traumatic injuries. Why her family is furious tonight. And some U.S. credit card companies are joining the fight to try and limit mass shootings. We'll talk about the changes being made to flag suspicious gun purchases coming up. of developing news in the closing arguments of the R. Kelly trial, because within just the last hour, we understand a juror had a panic attack in the courtroom. She's a woman who works for a public library, and she said she could not, in her words, go on a minute more. It all happened as prosecutors in their closing today went after Kelly, the former R&B star, calling him a sexual predator who more than a decade ago paid a girl he'd abused as a teen not to testify at trial. They say it worked in 2008 when he managed to walk free then, but this time around, witnesses have come forward, including one woman going by the pseudonym Jane. She testified she was the girl in a tape at the center of this trial and that Kelly sexually abused her hundreds of times. Kelly's being charged on 13 counts, including trial fixing and child pornography. Maggie Vespa is joining us now. And Maggie, you know, we don't know much more about this panic attack. I don't think. I know it happened just within the last hour. Did it affect the closing arguments at all? You know, it feels like it is a moment here when you look at how high profile and how high stakes this trial is, that feels like, you know, I said it, but a moment.
Definitely a moment, and a moment amid what is expected to be 7 hours of very graphic closing arguments by both sides in this case. And this woman, as you said, has been sitting through multiple hours starting at 10 a.m. today, so up, you know, 5+. And then this panic attack happened. She told the judge, I can't go on a minute longer. And this is after she sat through an incredibly graphic trial. This is a woman, according to our producer in the courtroom, who seems to be in her 20s or 30s, white woman, works at a public library. That's about all we know about her at this point. She had said during the jury selection process that she had not been terribly familiar with the allegations against R. Kelly, meaning that she had never seen that infamous Lifetime docuseries Surviving R. Kelly. But she had seen, you know, headlines about past allegations against him and past trials that he'd been through. But this has been a really graphic day where, just point by most graphic point, the prosecution first has been going through all of the allegations and all the statements made by these witnesses and these victims who have now come forward. So it's definitely, again, as you said, been a moment. As far as what it means for the trial, nothing really substantive, frankly. A lot of these cases, all of these cases have alternate jurors, and so they're going to slide one in here. The judge said he's going to replace it with a man in his 70s, and this will proceed forward. This juror, after this panic attack, has just basically now been excused. But a very tough day, Hallie.
If people are listening to this and going, well, wait a second, why are we talking about an R. Kelly trial? He was already sentenced in June, wasn't he? Yes, he was. He was sentenced to 30 years, but that was a separate federal trial in New York. Explain the distinction here, what we heard from the prosecution, and frankly, why experts say it's been kind of tough for the defense to argue against them here.
Definitely. It's been tough because this is, frankly, one of, as you point out, several trials that R. Kelly has been through, highly publicized trials. But just to kind of lay out what we're discussing and what's being argued in this case, this is not necessarily about his abusing or allegations that he abused women and girls. That's what we kind of went through in the trial a couple of years ago in New York, and he was sentenced earlier this year. This one is about how R. Kelly, prosecutors say, used his power and his money to silence victims in past trials, specifically in a 2008 trial, state charges here in Illinois tied to an infamous tape now, frankly, of R. Kelly abusing a then 14-year-old girl and then urinating on her. That girl at the time looked at the tape and said, I don't care what you think you see on that tape. That's not me. He never abused me. Well, now she's come forward. She's now in her 30s, and she said, I lied. He paid me to lie. And he also, she says, intimidated her and her mother into lying and used his staff to send them payments throughout the years and just kind of scare them out of talking to prosecutors. So that's kind of what this case is. R. Kelly's team has had a really difficult time arguing against this on day one. It kind of sums it up. His lawyer came out in front of the cameras and said he will not get the trial, the fair trial that the Constitution demands. So we'll see what the jury decides. Hallie.
Maggie Vespa, thank you very much. Appreciate your reporting on that. The victims of a car crash involving former Kansas City assistant coach Britt Reed are furious after a judge accepted Reed's guilty plea for driving drunk and crashing into 2 cars early last year. This is coming from a lawyer representing the victims. Reed's looking at up to 4 years in prison, but the 5 victims are upset the attorney is not looking for the maximum sentence. You might remember this crash was a huge deal when it happened. It hurt 6 people, including Ariel Young, a then 5-year-old girl who even got a traumatic brain injury because of this crash. Reed apologized in court, saying he made a huge mistake. He said, I didn't mean to hurt anyone. Britt, of course, also happens to be Andy Reed's son, head coach of the Kansas City Chiefs. Chiefs. Police say he was speeding when he hit two parked cars near Arrowhead Stadium just days before the team was going to play at the Super Bowl. Jesse Kirsch is joining me now. And again, Jesse, this was a headline-making thing when it happened. This crash that hurt two kids, including this little girl who was in a coma for more than a week. This family is upset. Explain more. What else did they say?
Yeah, Hallie, harsh words from the family attorney today. I'm going to read you their statement. In part, it says, the 5 victims of this crime are outraged. The prosecuting attorney is not seeking the maximum sentence allowable by law. The defendant is a prior offender whose actions caused a 5-year-old girl to be in a coma and seriously injured 3 others. And from what we understand, you talked about the traumatic brain injury that this girl suffered. The Kansas City Chiefs have come to an agreement to pay for her medical bills. This is something that, by all accounts, as we understand it, is going to be with her, if not for her entire life, certainly for years to come, the extent of her injuries. And so this is something that is certainly staying with this family months beyond when this crash happened, Hallie.
We mentioned it, but we have to talk about the fact that he's the son of the Kansas City Chiefs coach, right? Andy Reid. How is the team, the NFL, do we know how they're responding to this whole thing and the word of this plea deal?
Well, at this point, we have not heard back from the NFL or the Chiefs about Britt Reid pleading guilty earlier today. However, we do know, according to our producer who was in the courtroom earlier today, that Andy Reid was not there. There was no one from the Reid family there with Britt Reid. And we know that Britt Reid is no longer affiliated with the Kansas City Chiefs. So they have obviously separated from him. And as I mentioned, the team has stepped in to provide support for this girl's medical bills for what will surely be a lifelong litany of issues. But at this point, we have not heard from the NFL or from the team itself as to the actual outcome today. And as you mentioned, Britt Reid will be sentenced next month. He could face up to 4 years in prison, Hallie.
Jesse Kirsch, live for us on that. Jesse, thank you. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, credit card companies like American Express, Visa, MasterCard, they're going to start categorizing sales from gun shops. Advocates say it's going to help track suspicious transactions of guns and ammo that could end up in a mass shooting. But gun rights advocates and lobbyists say it will unfairly flag an industry when most sales don't lead to shootings. Before this, gun sales had just been considered general merchandise. Number 2, the January 6th Select Committee, according to multiple sources familiar with it, will hold its next September hearing, likely on September 28th. One area of focus could be the cabinet's discussion of removing former President Trump from office using the 25th Amendment after the Capitol attack, Number 3, the Twitter whistleblower Peter Zatko will testify in front of Congress tomorrow after warning about the app's security flaws and potential privacy threats. Some senators set to hear his testimony say they're worried about his allegations on Twitter, worried about the safety of powerful tech platforms. Number 4, the CDC is asking pediatricians to be on the lookout for a rare but serious respiratory infection in kids. It's not COVID, it's not the flu, but it's something that causes arms and legs to be weak, in some cases paralyzed. Health officials say symptoms are similar to the common cold, and kids with asthma might be at higher risk. Number 5, about 15,000 nurses in Minnesota walked off the job today, making this the biggest private sector strike in history. It's going to last 3 days. These nurses are fighting against 13 hospitals in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. They want better staffing. They want more money. Coming up, you know who else wants more money? Some railroad workers. They want better benefits, too. And if they don't get it, we could be looking at a nationwide strike. What this could mean for your travel, your wallet, and the stuff you get in the mail after the break. So in just the last couple hours, you had the Senate's top Republican, Mitch McConnell, preemptively blaming Democrats if rail companies and workers can't get to a labor agreement. Watch.
The supply chain crisis could get even worse, much worse, in the next few days if Democrats let their far-left big labor allies engage in massive railway worker strikes that would hamper the economy even further.
And even the hint of a freight strike is now affecting passenger trains. Look at this headline from the Washington Post. They're reporting Amtrak is set to cancel 3 long-distance routes because of it. The White House is trying to work this thing out. You have the Labor Secretary, Marty Walsh, putting off a planned trip to Ireland. And besides the canceled passenger routes, the freight strike could mean empty store shelves and food costs, already high because of inflation, maybe going up even more. One railway industry group puts it like this, warning that more than 1 billion UPS packages could get stuck during a strike. Do you get UPS packages? You probably do. Think about that. So far, several unions back President Biden's proposal to try to avoid a strike, which includes more money, but it doesn't change some of the quality of life issues. And that's been a sticking point for the two biggest unions who are still holding out. A labor spokesperson tells CNBC that workers don't want to be afraid to take a sick day or a vacation day anymore. Let's get to Carol Lee. And Carol, I just think it's so significant that this has been elevated. And we've talked about this on this show before. It is elevated to the level of the president, to the White House, right? And now we're already seeing this line of attack from Mitch McConnell, previewing what is likely to be the Republican attack on this.
Yeah, that's right, Hallie. And a White House official tells me tonight that the president himself has been involved in these discussions just today, saying that the president and members of his cabinet today have been calling both the rail company side and the union side and talking to them and really urging them to come to some sort of resolution here. And that really underscores the level of concern that this has inside the White House. Now, they're saying that this is something urgent. They're trying to prod the parties to come to an agreement. And look, they largely have. A large number of the unions have agreed that to the White House's proposal, this presidential emergency board that intervenes and acts as kind of a mediator. The proposal that they put forward, a lot of the unions have bought into that, but there's some big holdouts here. And so what you're hearing from the White House tonight is that they are very much paying very close attention to this, and that it's kind of a full court press here all the way up to the presidential level to try to get these sides to reach some sort of agreement to avert this economic crisis that's really looming over.
What about this law that's on the books, right, where it's from, I think the FDR era, where Congress could step in? They could put into place a contract. Like, let's say the worst case scenario happened and the companies and the workers can't get to a deal, the deadline hits, fine. The Chamber of Commerce is telling lawmakers, do that again, right? Put that back into action here. Is that something that's on the table? Like, is that an option the White House thinks could be palatable or no?
No, they don't. And I can read you some of what a White House official told me about that. I mean, they're basically saying that this is something that the parties need to resolve. It's an issue that can and should be worked out between the rail companies and the unions, not by Congress. So they're very much against this. They're saying that the rail companies and the unions have worked out agreements in previous negotiations, and they can do this again. Now, when Congress did this before, it's been decades. It was just a different climate. I mean, you played Mitch McConnell's statement there. We're 2 months from a midterm election. The Congress can barely keep the lights on half the time. And so there's not a lot of will here for the Republicans to come in and bail Democrats out of an issue like this, something where the president could take an economic hit right before these midterms, when the timing of this is such that it comes as the White House and Democrats and the president are feeling momentum from some good economic indicators, lower gas prices, things like that, but also passing some legislation that they feel good about, this Inflation Reduction Act, which the president's going to celebrate with an event at the White House tomorrow. So they don't like this congressional option. And frankly, there's not a lot of feeling that they could actually get somewhere with that option, that this Congress is not inclined to take these steps that maybe a previous Congress might have done.
Carol Lee, it's great reporting. Thank you very much for bringing it to us. I know we're going to be tracking this in the days to come. Appreciate it. Coming up, supporters of former President Trump divided over who to support in a House primary race tomorrow. How this could help determine who controls Congress. Plus, the mistake on an NFL team's logo that caused a whole bunch of stuff to be pulled off the shelves. No merch. Bye-bye. We'll tell you why. NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day, and because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. From our Northeast Bureau, the second trial for Alex Jones in the Sandy Hook hoax case will begin in Connecticut tomorrow. To be clear, Jones has described it as a hoax. It obviously was not. A 6-member jury will decide how much Jones should pay families since he was found liable for damages at his first trial. This is expected to last about a month. From our Southern Bureau, Customs and Border Protection officers in Del Rio, port of entry in Texas, seized the biggest meth shipment ever, worth, listen to this, $11.9 million. It's the biggest seizure of drugs at that port. They uncovered 320 packages containing more than 1,000 pounds of alleged meth. From our Washington Bureau, the Washington Commanders accidentally sold and then pulled coffee mugs with their team logo. Why? That is not the Commanders logo, okay? Do you see that? That is a silhouette of Washington State. The Commanders represent Washington, D.C. That is a different part of the country. They play their games in Maryland, not on the West Coast. This is not even the first time this kind of mistake has happened, but if you are a Commanders fan, you will be happy to know they beat Jacksonville last night. If you're an Eagles fan, you're not so thrilled to hear that. New Hampshire holding primaries tomorrow, and the Republican races there are going to set up the matchup for races that could help determine control of Congress. And one of these House races is interesting because it is a kind of MAGA proxy war. Trump loyalists divided over who to support in this one race. You've got Kevin McCarthy and Mike Pompeo supporting one candidate, Matt Mowers. You have Jim Jordan and Ted Cruz supporting a different candidate in that race, Caroline Leavitt, both of them two former Trump staffers. Mowers used to work for the State Department, and Leavitt was in the comms department at the White House. She's trying to become one of the first Gen Z members of Congress. The, if you will, elephant in the room, so to speak, actually not in the room yet, the Trump endorsement. Joining me now is Dasha Burns. And Dasha, that's because former President Trump has decided not to endorse yet in this race. And it's interesting because you have this sort of Trump Republican versus Trump Republican battle here in this House race. We haven't talked about House races a ton, but the House races matter too.
Yeah, absolutely they matter. And Hallie, I have to tell you, I literally made that exact same joke about the elephant not in the room to my producer earlier today. So I have to say, great minds. But look, this is a race where you have the Republican establishment, the Republican Party, and the Trump wing of the party sort of split. And, you know, when you say names like Mike Pompeo, like Ted Cruz, who both campaigned for Mowers and Leavitt, respectively, what do you hear there? Maybe some echoes of the 2024 potential presidential run. Interesting to see those folks here potentially testing the ground here in what is expected to still be the first in the nation presidential primary for the Republican Party. But you're right, no Trump endorsement yet. So it'll be interesting to see which of these two candidates that are both very much touting those MAGA, those Trump world ties, which of them will sort of out MAGA the other, which is very much what they've been trying to do throughout this campaign season. What's important to pay attention to, though, we've talked about this before, the primary is very different from the general. So whichever of these two candidates wins tomorrow, and it is going to be a tight race from all of the polling that we've been seeing here, Leavitt trailing just by about 2 points or so in the most recent polling, whichever one of them wins is going to then have to campaign for a broader, more general voter base. And in New Hampshire, you've got a state that has a lot of independents. 38% of voters are unaffiliated. I asked Caroline Leavitt earlier today how she intends to win over some of those voters. Take a listen to what she told me.
We have to get the government out of our lives. That's the message I've been sharing over the past year, and we will not stop sharing that with every single voter, outworking all of our opponents, both Republicans and Democrats, until November 8th.
And Hallie, important to note here, this primary is coming pretty late in the season here, so whoever wins is going to have to very quickly get the entire party behind them to bring those folks together to unite the party ahead of November 8th, Hallie.
The other big race here, you know, you talked about the House race here. The Senate Republican primary is interesting. It's a crowded field. You got the top two contenders going up against Senator Maggie Hassan in November. These two people, retired Army General Don Bolduc and State Senator Chuck Morse. Democrats want one more than the other for perhaps obvious reasons, Dasha.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right on that point, Hallie. And they've been spending quite a bit of money, millions of dollars, to try to sink State Senator Chuck Morse and hoping that his opponent, Don Bolduc, wins. They see Bolduc as potentially a weaker candidate because he is farther right. And look, what we're seeing in this Senate primary here is kind of the culmination of what we've been seeing throughout the primary season as it comes to a close here. You've got a more moderate candidate with the establishment behind him, with the money, establishment money behind him, very importantly. And then you've got the Trumpier, more hardline conservative candidate and retired Brigadier General Don Bolduc, who seems to have that MAGA base behind him. And so far, the way these primaries have played out, it does seem that the primary system as it is right now in states like this tends to favor those farther right candidates. And Bolduc has been ahead in the polls. The GOP, the establishment, the main mainstream party, certainly hoping for more. So they believe he'll be a more competitive candidate, a more likely chance to pick up this seat, which will be critical for Republicans. Democrats, on the other hand, desperately trying to defend this seat. So really, really important for both parties. What happens tomorrow could really set up a really significant fight here, Hallie.
It's good to be back with you. I'll see you here tomorrow, same time, same place. Coverage picks up right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.